The digital skyline of the global financial system appears immutable, a shimmering grid of fiber optics and high-frequency data packets that facilitate trillions of dollars in daily transactions. Yet, beneath this veneer of absolute security lies a structural fragility that the public rarely glimpses. Imagine a morning where the ATM screen remains blank, where your digital wallet shows a balance of zero, and where the clearinghouses that settle the world's trades simply stop responding. This is not the premise of a dystopian novel, but the actual threat profile facing the United States Treasury and the Federal Reserve today. We are no longer in an era where bank robberies involve physical vaults and getaway cars. The modern heist is a silent, algorithmic intrusion targeting the very plumbing of our economic reality. As we track the flow of global capital, we find that the most dangerous weapon in the 21st century isn't a missile, but a line of code capable of devaluing a currency or freezing a nation's liquidity in a heartbeat. The silent cyber war has already begun, and the first casualty is the illusion of systemic invulnerability. The first cracks in the system often appear as minor latency issues within the Fedwire Fund Service, or the Clearinghouse Interbank Payment System, CHIPS. To the average consumer, this looks like a delayed paycheck or a credit card transaction that takes an extra 10 seconds to authorize. However, in the high-stakes world of institutional finance, these seconds are an eternity. When billions of dollars move per millisecond, a synchronization error is the digital equivalent of a massive cardiac event. If the ledger cannot verify the origin of a fund transfer, the entire chain of trust dissolves. We begin to see a liquidity freeze, where banks, terrified of counterparty risk and ghost assets, stop lending to one another. This is where the silent war escalates. While the public remains unaware, the interbank lending rate, the interest banks charge each other, begins to spike uncontrollably. This isn't caused by a shift in monetary policy, but by a fundamental breakdown in the digital infrastructure that identifies who owns what. As the digital friction intensifies, the visual indicators of a standard economic day begin to distort. On trading floors, the bid-ask spread, the difference between the highest price a buyer is willing to pay and the lowest price a seller will accept, widens to levels unseen since the 2008 crash. In a healthy market, these spreads are paper-thin, reflecting high liquidity. But as the silent cyber attack progresses, the spread becomes a canyon. Market makers, the firms responsible for keeping the gears turning, start to pull back, fearing that the prices they see on their screens are phantom quotes generated by malicious bots. This uncertainty triggers a flight to safety. Capital begins to exit the equity markets in a frantic rush toward short-term government bonds. Yet even the Treasury market isn't immune. When the very record-keeping systems that track bond ownership are under siege, safety becomes a relative term. The indicators are screaming, but because the crisis is happening in the dark fiber of the network, rather than on the floor of the stock exchange, the silence is deafening. The transition from technical glitch to public panic occurs when the facade of the digital wallet finally cracks. Across the nation, consumers attempting to log into their banking apps are met with 502 gateway timeout errors, or, more chillingly, balances that do not reflect their true holdings. At this stage, the psychological dam breaks. This is the moment of the digital bank run. Unlike the 1930s, there are no lines stretching around the block, at least not initially. Instead, the panic manifests as millions of simultaneous withdrawal attempts that overwhelm the server architecture. As the news spreads through social media, the velocity of the crisis accelerates. People rush to gas stations and grocery stores, only to find that the point-of-sale (POS) systems are offline because the back-end processing networks are paralyzed. This isn't just an inconvenience. It is the sudden halting of the circulatory system of the American economy. When the medium of exchange vanishes, the value of every asset is called into question, and the social contract begins to fray at the edges. When the digital infrastructure of a global superpower is compromised, the first major casualty on the economic dashboard is the exchange rate. In the silent cyber war, the US dollar's value is not undermined by a change in manufacturing output, but by a sudden vacuum of settlement certainty. International investors, seeing the paralysis of the American clearing systems, begin a massive liquidation of dollar-denominated assets. This triggers a vicious cycle of currency depreciation. As the dollar weakens against a basket of foreign currencies, the cost of imported goods, from electronics to essential raw materials, skyrockets instantly. This is imported inflation, and it hits the consumer's pocketbook before the government can even issue a statement. The foreign exchange, forex market, becomes a battlefield of erratic candles, where the lack of reliable data causes the currency to swing by 5% or 10% in a single hour. This volatility isn't just a number on a screen. It represents the evaporating purchasing power of every American savings account. As the global market loses faith in the digital integrity of the greenback, within the heart of the financial machine, the stock market's automated systems begin to cannibalize themselves. Modern trading is dominated by algorithmic high-frequency trading, HFT, where computers execute thousands of orders per second based on mathematical models. When a cyber intrusion corrupts the data feeds these algorithms rely on, it triggers a flash crash on an unprecedented scale. Without accurate price discovery, the circuit breakers, designed to pause trading during extreme volatility, trip repeatedly. But they offer no relief because the underlying data corruption remains. We see the emergence of dark pools becoming completely opaque as institutional investors withdraw to protect their remaining capital. The loss of market capitalization isn't just a loss for hedge funds. It represents the evaporation of trillions of dollars in 401k, plans, and pension funds. As equity values plummet, the wealth effect reverses, causing a sharp contraction in consumer spending. The economy isn't just slowing down. It is being systematically decapitalized by an invisible hand that isn't seeking profit, but total systemic failure. As the crisis deepens, the focus shifts to the credit default swap, CDS market, a critical but often misunderstood layer of the financial world. CDS act as insurance policies against the default of debt. In a silent cyber war, when the digital ledger of a major bank becomes unreliable, the perceived risk of that bank defaulting surges. Consequently, the cost of these CDS contracts skyrockets. This is a terrifying indicator for the broader economy. It signals that the market is betting on the collapse of the very institutions that hold the nation's deposits. High CDS spreads create a feedback loop of fear. As insurance becomes more expensive, the bank's credit rating is slashed, its borrowing costs rise, and its stock price craters. This resembles the death spiral seen in the 2008 financial crisis, but with a digital twist. If the data verifying the bank's underlying assets is encrypted by ransomware or erased, the CDS market effectively prices the institution at zero. This creates a systemic black hole, where liquidity is sucked out of the market, leaving the economy paralyzed. The paralysis of the financial core inevitably bleeds into the physical world, manifesting as a catastrophic disruption of the real economy. This is where the abstract world of high finance meets the concrete reality of the supply chain. Most modern businesses operate on just-in-time inventory systems and rely on short-term revolving credit lines to pay suppliers and staff. When the banking network is under cyber siege, these credit lines are frozen. A shipping container full of essential medical supplies or grain sits at a port because the digital bill of lading cannot be verified. Or the electronic payment to the terminal operator is stuck in a pending state. This creates a supply-side shock that mirrors the worst days of the 2020 pandemic, but with a more sinister root cause. As shelves empty and factories go dark, the velocity of money, the rate at which currency circulates through the economy drops to near zero. Without the ability to transact, the economy doesn't just enter a recession, it enters a state of suspended animation, where the value of a product is irrelevant because the mechanism to buy it has ceased to exist. To understand the gravity of a digital collapse, we must examine the ghosts of financial history, starting with the 1997 Asian financial crisis. While that crisis was triggered by currency speculation rather than code, the mechanics of the contagion remain identical. It began with the Thai baht, as the government ran out of foreign exchange reserves to defend its peg to the dollar. Like a digital firewall failing, once the Thai economy was breached, the virus spread to South Korea and Indonesia. Investors panicked, pulling capital out of the entire region in a herd mentality that ignored individual country fundamentals. In a modern cyber war, this contagion happens at light speed. The 1997 crisis showed us that when liquidity vanishes, even healthy companies go bankrupt overnight. The IMF had to step in with massive bailouts, but the social cost was high. Unemployment tripled, and the middle class saw their savings halved. This serves as a grim case study for today. If a cyber attack mimics these capital outflows by locking up reserves, the IMF of the future may find itself powerless against a foe that doesn't use spreadsheets, but exploits the very software the IMF relies on. For a more recent parallel of a nation being digitally and financially severed, we turn to Argentina in 2001. Facing a massive debt crisis and a run on the banks, the government implemented the Corralito, a measure that strictly limited the amount of cash citizens could withdraw from their accounts. In our modern silent cyber war, a hacking incident on the central ledger achieves the same result without the need for a government decree. In Argentina, the sudden lack of physical currency led to a total collapse of consumer demand and triggered violent social unrest. People held credit cards and bank statements that said they were wealthy, but they couldn't buy bread. This disconnect between digital wealth and transactional ability is the primary goal of financial infrastructure hacking. The Argentine experience teaches us that when the trust in the medium of exchange is broken, the economy reverts to a primitive state of barter and script currencies. In a cyber-attacked U.S. economy, your brokerage account might show $1 million, but if the settlement layer is encrypted, that $1 million is functionally non-existent, leaving you as vulnerable as a citizen in 2001 Buenos Aires. The 2015 Greek debt crisis offers a chilling preview of how a nation's economy looks when the digital faucet is turned off. As the European Central Bank squeezed liquidity to the Greek banking sector, the government was forced to impose a bank holiday and a €60 daily withdrawal limit at ATMs. For weeks, the nation's economic lifeblood was metered out in tiny increments. In a silent cyber war targeting American financial infrastructure, the same scenario unfolds, but without a centralized policy decision. If a ransomware attack locks the core banking software of major retail banks, we see a de facto corralito. The Greek case study highlights a critical vulnerability: the over-reliance on digital payments. As electronic systems failed, the Greek economy saw a 25% contraction in GDP. Businesses that couldn't process digital payments simply shuttered. For the American viewer, the lesson is clear. In a systemic cyber lockdown, the efficiency of our cashless society becomes our greatest liability. When the network is down, the most sophisticated economy in the world can be reduced to the speed of a paper check, and eventually, total stagnation. Turkey and Venezuela provide contemporary warnings of what happens when the informational integrity of a currency is lost. In these nations, we have seen how hyperinflation and currency devaluation are accelerated by a loss of faith in the central bank's ability to manage the digital ledger. In a cyber hacking scenario, if an attacker successfully alters the money supply figures on a central bank server or creates ghost liquidity, the result is a catastrophic loss of purchasing power. In Venezuela, the bolívar became so devalued that people turned to digital gold or black market barter systems just to survive. If a silent cyber war were to inject trillions of fake dollars into the digital circulation, or, conversely, delete the records of tax payments, the U.S. would face a similar inflationary shock. This isn't the slow inflation of a typical economic cycle. It is a vertical spike caused by the total corruption of the price signal. When the data used to calculate the Consumer Price Index, CPI, or the money supply, MEM2, can no longer be trusted, the currency becomes a hot potato that no one wants to hold, leading to a flight from the dollar that mirrors the most volatile emerging markets. The fundamental difference between these historical case studies and a modern silent cyber war lies in the speed of ruin. In the past, economic collapses were often visible months in advance. Excessive debt, falling reserves, or political instability provided a roadmap for the coming storm. But a cyber attack on financial infrastructure is a non-linear event. It doesn't move at the speed of a trade or a government decree. It moves at the speed of light. In a traditional crisis, the central bank of last resort can step in to provide liquidity. However, if the very systems used to distribute that liquidity, the digital pipelines of the Fed, are the targets of the attack, the traditional toolkit becomes useless. This creates a systemic blind spot. We are transitionally moving from a world where risk is managed through capital requirements to a world where risk is managed through cyber resilience. If the integrity of the data is compromised, the capital itself becomes irrelevant. As we look at the U.S. landscape, we realize that our greatest economic strength, our highly integrated, high-speed digital architecture, has become our most significant single point of failure. Transitioning from global comparisons to the domestic front, the silent cyber war targets the very crown jewel of the American economy, the U.S. dollar's status as the world's primary reserve currency. The global financial system operates on the SWIFT network, a messaging service that allows banks to send and receive information about financial transactions. If a sophisticated actor breaches this infrastructure or the Fed's own internal ledgers, they don't just steal money, they steal validity. If the world begins to doubt whether a digital dollar held in a Tokyo bank is the same as one held in New York due to data corruption, the exorbitant privilege of the U.S. economy vanishes. We would see an immediate spike in Treasury yields, as investors demand a higher security premium to hold American debt. This isn't just a Wall Street problem. High Treasury yields translate directly into higher mortgage rates for families in the Midwest and higher borrowing costs for small businesses. The silent war effectively turns the U.S. national debt into a weapon, using the digital vulnerability of our payment systems to trigger a massive, involuntary deleveraging of the American dream. The shockwaves of a digital infrastructure breach would hit the American real estate market with the force of a tectonic shift. Most people view their homes as physical assets, but in the modern era, home ownership is a digital data point. Title deeds, mortgage liens, and escrow records are stored in centralized county databases and private bank servers. If a sophisticated wiper malware were to erase these records or encrypt them with an unbreakable key, the legal basis for trillions of dollars in household wealth would evaporate. We would enter a period of title paralysis. Without a verifiable digital record of who owns what, houses cannot be sold, refinanced, or used as collateral for small business loans. The liquidity of the housing market, the ability to turn a home into cash, would drop to zero. For the individual homeowner, this means their largest asset is suddenly locked, even while the bank's automated systems might continue to demand mortgage payments. This disconnect creates a massive legal and economic vacuum, freezing the primary source of generational wealth for the American middle class. As the digital fog thickens, the Federal Reserve finds itself in a monetary blind spot. Normally, The Fed adjusts interest rates based on real-time data, employment figures, consumer spending, and the Consumer Price Index. But, in a silent cyber war, the data feeds themselves become suspect. If an adversary injects false low-inflation data into government servers, the Fed might keep interest rates too low, inadvertently fueling a hidden hyperinflationary fire. Conversely, if the system shows a false liquidity trap, the Fed might flood the market with digital dollars that have nowhere to go, further devaluing the currency. The central bank's primary tool, the manipulation of the federal funds rate, relies on a functioning transmission mechanism. If the banks are too scared to lend because their digital ledgers are under attack, lowering interest rates to zero has the same effect as pushing on a string. The command and control center of the U.S. economy becomes a cockpit where the instruments are spinning wildly, leaving the pilots unable to determine their true altitude or airspeed. The cumulative effect of these disruptions leads to a sharp and sudden contraction in the gross domestic product, GDP. In a modern economy, GDP is a measure of the flow of value. When the digital pipes are clogged, that flow stops. We begin to see a negative wealth effect that transcends the stock market. As individual Americans realize their digital balances are insecure or inaccessible, they immediately halt all discretionary spending. This isn't just a belt-tightening phase. It is a total cessation of the consumer engine that drives 70% of the U.S. economy. Retailers, unable to process payments or pay their own staff, are forced into mass layoffs. This creates a terrifying feedback loop. Unemployment rises because of a technical failure, which further reduces demand, leading to more business failures. The real economy becomes a mirror of the corrupted digital one, broken, stagnant, and filled with uncertainty. The silent cyber war effectively achieves what no foreign military could. It forces the world's largest economy into a self-induced coma, proving that in the digital age, a nation's GDP is only as strong as the encryption protecting its ledgers. In the high-security bunkers of the Federal Reserve and the Treasury's Department of Financial Infrastructure Resilience, the response to a silent cyber war is governed by Project Hamilton and other contingency frameworks. The first move is not economic, but technical: the implementation of air-gapped settlements. To save the dollar, the government may be forced to disconnect the nation's core ledgers from the public internet, reverting to a secure, private network accessible only to verified institutional nodes. This is the financial equivalent of martial law. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York may activate the discount window on a scale never seen before, providing massive, direct injections of liquidity to banks whose digital assets have been frozen. However, this creates a secondary risk, moral hazard, and the potential for a massive expansion of the monetary base. If the Fed prints digital emergency credits to replace stolen or encrypted funds, they risk a long-term inflationary spiral. The government's response is a desperate balancing act, trying to keep the heart of the economy beating while the digital arteries are being cauterized to prevent the spread of malicious code. Beyond the digital curtain, the government must address the physical vacuum of currency. In a total systemic lockdown, the Treasury may authorize the emergency release of strategic cash reserves. While we live in a digital age, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing maintains the capability to surge the production of physical banknotes. However, the logistics of distributing tens of billions of dollars in physical cash to a nation of 330 million people in the midst of a communications blackout is a Herculean task. The government might be forced to prioritize the essential economy, ensuring that grocery stores, pharmacies, and gas stations can continue to operate using paper currency while the digital grid is rebuilt. This transition represents a humiliating but necessary regression. Federal agents and the National Guard could be deployed to secure armored car routes, effectively turning the invisible hand of the market into a very visible, state-managed distribution system. This phase of the response is about social cohesion. If people can buy food, the government buys time to purge the malware from the financial nervous system. As the domestic crisis stabilizes, the silent cyber war shifts to the geopolitical arena. The United States must engage in digital financial diplomacy to prevent a global abandonment of the dollar. The Treasury activates the FX swap lines, a mechanism where the Fed provides U.S. dollars to foreign central banks, like the ECB or the Bank of Japan, in exchange for their currencies. This is crucial to prevent the international basis swap market from collapsing, which would otherwise make it impossible for global corporations to hedge their risks. Simultaneously, the U.S. Cyber Command may launch offensive countervaluation operations, targeting the financial assets of the perceived attackers to create a digital deterrent. This is a high-stakes game of mutually assured destruction in the digital realm. If the U.S. can prove it can revalidate its ledger while compromising the attacker's own wealth, it re-establishes its hegemony. The response marks the birth of a new era of financial sovereignty, where a nation's power is measured not by its gold reserves, but by the immutability of its central bank's code. For the individual caught in the crossfire of this invisible conflict, the first rule of survival is transactional redundancy. In an era of total digital integration, having your entire net worth tied to a single login is a systemic risk. Financial experts now suggest a tiered approach to liquidity. This means maintaining a percentage of wealth in physical bearer assets, assets that do not require a functioning internet connection or a bank's permission to have value. While we have transitioned away from the gold standard, physical gold and silver remain the ultimate hedge of last resort because they carry no counterparty risk. Additionally, keeping a controlled reserve of physical cash outside of the banking system is no longer viewed as paranoid, but as a pragmatic buffer against a temporary network blackout. This isn't about betting against the U.S. economy. It's about ensuring you have the optionality to survive the first 72 hours of a systemic freeze when the digital gates are locked. Survival in a cyber war is defined by your ability to bridge the gap between the failure of the digital grid and the restoration of order. Beyond physical assets, the individual must practice digital hygiene as a form of capital preservation. In a silent cyber war, your personal identity is the bridge an attacker uses to reach your assets. Using hardware security keys, rather than SMS-based two-factor authentication, becomes an essential economic shield. Furthermore, diversifying custodial risk is critical. Spreading liquid assets across different types of institutions, such as a large national bank, a local credit union, and a brokerage, ensures that a localized breach at one institution doesn't zero out your entire life savings. Investors are also looking toward decentralized finance, DeFi, and cold storage solutions. While volatile, assets held on a private blockchain with offline keys are theoretically immune to a centralized banking wipe. However, the ultimate survival strategy is knowledge capital. Understanding how the Federal Reserve operates and tracking indicators like the LIBOR transition or the Secured Overnight Financing Rate, SOFR, allows an individual to spot the smoke of a liquidity crisis before the digital fire consumes the interface. In this new landscape, the informed citizen is the only one who can navigate the silence. As the digital dust begins to settle, the true resilience of a society is measured by the strength of its microeconomies. When the centralized systems of Wall Street and the Fed are compromised, the survival of the individual depends on local networks of trust. This involves the community safety net, neighborhood-level agreements, and local credit unions that operate on personal relationships rather than anonymous data packets. In a silent cyber war, the ability to trade labor, locally produced goods, or even specialized knowledge becomes the new hard currency. We see a shift toward asset-backed living, where individuals invest in the efficiency of their own homes, solar power, water filtration, and stockpiled essentials to reduce their dependence on the fragile digital grid. This is not a retreat into the past, but a strategic evolution. By minimizing your systemic footprint, you insulate your family from the shocks of a global infrastructure failure. The lesson from history is that while empires may struggle with the complexity of their networks, the localized economy is the bedrock that remains when the lights on the digital dashboard flicker and fade. The silent cyber war is not a conflict that will end with a signed treaty or a clear victory parade. It is a permanent feature of the modern economic landscape, a state of constant friction that requires a fundamental shift in how we perceive value. We have built a civilization on the speed of light, trading physical certainty for digital efficiency. As we have seen, this trade-off comes with a hidden cost: the vulnerability of our very survival to the integrity of a distant server. The true insight for the viewer is that while the financial infrastructure may be virtual, the consequences of its failure are visceral. The future of the American economy will be defined by cyber resilience, the ability to take a hit, lose a ledger, and still maintain the social trust required to function. We must move forward with a cautious respect for the tools we use, understanding that in a world of invisible wars, the most valuable assets aren't the ones you see on a screen, but the ones that remain when the screen goes dark. The silence is not an absence of conflict. It is the sound of a new reality where the code is the currency, and the war is already won or lost in the quiet hum of the data center. As we peer into the near future, the silent cyber war is forcing a radical evolution of the global power structure. The rise of financial data sovereignty. In the wake of systemic breaches, nations are realizing that depending on a shared, open network global payment system is an unacceptable national security risk. This is leading to the fragmentation of the global financial map into distinct digital blocks. We are seeing the accelerated deployment of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, designed not just for convenience, but as military-grade encrypted ledgers. Unlike the current internet-based banking, these systems are being built to operate on sovereign, air-gapped satellite networks, independent of the public web. This represents a fundamental shift. Money is no longer just a medium of exchange. It has become a sovereign code. While this offers a new layer of protection against external hackers, it also marks the end of financial anonymity, as every transaction becomes a permanent, traceable heartbeat on the government's master ledger. This shift towards sovereign digital currencies triggers a new kind of geopolitical conflict, the algorithmic arms race. In this high-stakes arena, conventional military hardware is secondary to the power of quantum-ready encryption. Global superpowers are no longer just competing for oil or territory. They are competing for the ability to break the financial encryption of their rivals, while making their own unhackable. We are entering an era of cyber mercantilism, where nations attempt to hoard computing power as if it were gold. If an adversary can successfully execute a zero-day exploit on a rival's central bank ledger, they can effectively devalue that nation's currency or erase its tax revenue without firing a single bullet. The battlefield has moved from the physical world to the deep architecture of the global economy. In this environment, a nation's economic health is determined not by its trade balance, but by its cyber defensive depth, the ability of its financial nervous system to sustain a direct hit and keep the blood of capital flowing. For the average American, this perpetual state of digital siege transforms the American dream into a strategy of economic resilience. The psychological fallout of the silent cyber war creates a permanent shift in consumer behavior. We are moving away from the just-in-time economy toward a just-in-case mindset. Families are no longer viewing their wealth solely through the lens of a brokerage app. They are diversifying into analog backups. This includes physical commodities, localized energy production, and participation in community-based credit networks that operate on personal trust rather than anonymous data. The silent war has exposed a harsh truth. The more complex and interconnected our systems become, the more fragile they are. In this new era, the most successful individuals are those who can navigate the digital world while remaining untethered from it, maintaining the optionality to thrive, even when the screens go dark and the global ledger is under repair. Ultimately, the silent cyber war teaches us that the true foundation of an economy isn't the technology that facilitates it, but the social trust that underpins it. We have built a world where wealth is invisible, moving at the speed of thought across a web of fiber optic cables. But as we have seen, when that digital architecture is threatened, the world returns to its oldest constants: food, energy, and human cooperation. The future of America will not be won by those with the fastest algorithms alone, but by a society that can balance its digital brilliance with physical grit. As we step into this uncertain horizon, we must remember that a currency is only as strong as the nation's resolve to protect the integrity of its truth. The screen may flicker, the ledgers may be attacked, and the silence may feel heavy, but the real economy, built on the labor and trust of people, is what will endure. In the age of the invisible war, the most valuable asset you can ever own is the wisdom to be prepared for the day the lights don't come back on. How does this story resonate with you? I'd like to hear your perspective, so feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. If you found this video useful, consider subscribing and giving it a like. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.